Let me read to you a passage from the 23rd chapter of St. Matthew, verses 1 to 12. It's the Gospel for Tuesday of the second week of Lent. St. Matthew writes, Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honour at banquets, seats of honour in synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called Master. You have but one Master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." That's from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. So, what does that suggest to us, those words of our Lord? Well, if a person discovers Christ as a real person, makes him the object of his love, and chooses to follow him closely, the question for that person will then be, what is it to follow Jesus Christ closely? What does it entail? Numerous answers have been and are given to this question, and indeed it is a multifaceted matter. However, there is one path that is essential if one is to follow the path that Christ takes. It is the path of humility. It is always helpful to turn to the teaching of the saints, especially those who succeeded in helping many people to take the path of following Christ closely. One such master was St. Ignatius Loyola, the great Spanish founder of the Jesuits in the 16th century, and the author of the famous little manual called the Spiritual Exercises. These spiritual exercises take the one doing them through a series of considerations about Christ, which invite him to choose to love Christ and to follow his example. One such consideration in the spiritual exercises is called the meditation on two standards. The first standard being the standard of Satan, and the second being the standard of Christ. In presenting the standard of Satan, Ignatius describes how Satan instructs his demons to tempt man, and I quote, to covet riches, as Satan himself is accustomed to do in most cases, that they may the more easily attain the empty honours of this world, and then come to overweening pride. The first step then will be riches, and then come honour, and then the third is pride. From these three steps the evil one leads to all other vices. That's what Ignatius writes in that meditation. So in his system of spiritual thought, pride is at the heart of our problem. And then, turning to the standard of Christ, he describes Christ inviting his followers to poverty, and then the deprivation of honours, and then humility. That is his path, and it is the opposite of the path of Satan. Now, are we prepared to follow him along this path? In our gospel passage today, our Lord directs both the crowds and his disciples not to be influenced by the example of the scribes and the Pharisees, while respecting, however, their due religious authority. So the crowds and the disciples had before them, on the one hand, the example of Christ, and on the other hand, the example of the scribes and the Pharisees. We are told elsewhere in the Gospel that they loved money, and that at least on one occasion they laughed at our Lord's teaching on money. In our passage today, our Lord describes them by saying that they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. They loved the power, then, that came with their religious standing and their religious authority. And our Lord continues, all their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honour at banquets, seats of honour in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. So their wealth, their position, their power, and their influence over others were all feeding their pride and desire for exaltation. Anyone who aspires to live the Christian life in union with the living Jesus must recognize the profound tendency within us to follow this path so diametrically opposed to the path of Jesus. That is our tendency, and we need to be very much alive to it, because it is very easy for us to put it out of our own sight, let alone out of the sight of others. Our ingrained fallen propensity is towards riches leading to self-exaltation, riches in the broad sense, whereas the path Jesus trod was that of poverty and humiliation. Satan's heart is utterly filled with pride, while the heart of Christ is profoundly humble. We have a choice to make. Let us make that choice between Christ and Satan, between Christ and all those influences which are contrary to the path of Christ. Our Lord finishes his words today with this warning: whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Satan, who exalted himself, has been and will be humbled. Christ, who humbled himself, has been and will be and is exalted. Let us take our place with Christ and live this decision out in the options of everyday life.